Picture the scene. You walk into a room, a very ornate, very gold, very red room. It feels ancient. The air probably smells like old leather and floor polish. And you look around and you see about 800 people.
Right. It's a lot of people.
It's a sea of gray hair, maybe some ermine robes depending on the day, and just a lot of very serious expressions. And then the realization hits you.
What's that?
These people are paid to be here. They have a massive influence on the laws of the land, but you didn't vote for a single one of them.
It's a striking visual, and honestly, for a modern democracy, it's a bit of a bewildering one.
Bewildering is putting it politely. When we think about the House of Lords, most of us just, scratch our heads. It's this massive group, 800-ish people,
Right.
mostly older, all unelected, sitting in the upper house. And let's be real, when you bring this up, nobody says, oh, thank goodness for the intricate constitutional balance of the upper chamber.
No. Usually it's a punchline.
Right. It's the complaints. We've all heard them. It's where politicians go to retire.
Or it's nothing but bishops, donors, and failed MPs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the big one, which is hard to argue with, no one voted for them. Why do they get a say? It just feels like a relic.
It does, like a piece of furniture you inherited that doesn't fit, but you can't quite throw it out.
Exactly.
And that skepticism is valid, objectively. If you were designing a system today, you wouldn't draw this. But we have a really interesting stack of sources today that challenge that knee-jerk reaction. The material we're diving into asks a boring but absolutely necessary question.
Which is?
What is the House of Lords actually for? Not in theory, not what the history books say it was for in 1800, but right now, today.
Yeah.
What is its job?
Okay.
Because before we can shout about reforming it or, abolishing it, we have to understand what the machine is actually doing while it's humming away.
I like that approach. We're skipping the should it exist argument for a second just to veer at the mechanics. Because you're right. I think most of us operate on those one-liners. We think it's just a fancy retirement home.
But there is work happening there, clearly. Laws are going in and coming out different.
Precisely.
And the source material offers one of the best analogies I have ever encountered to explain this dynamic. It strips away all the complex jargon and frames Parliament as a family unit.
I saw this in the reading, and it actually made the whole thing click for me. So in this analogy, the House of Commons, the elected MPs, the ones we see shouting on the news, they are the adult child.
Right. Think about the role of an adult child in a family. They have the job. They're the ones earning the paycheck. They control the household budget.
They make the decisions.
They make the decisions. They decide if we're getting a new car or fixing the roof. Ultimately, they hold the power.
They have the keys to the house. They're driving.
Exactly. But then you have the House of Lords. In this analogy, the Lords act as the grandparent.
The grandparent. Now, this is crucial. We aren't talking about the kind of grandparent who controls the inheritance and tells everyone what to do.
No, and that is the key distinction. In a modern family, the grandparent doesn't run the house. They don't get to tell the adult child, no, you can't buy that car.
They can't overrule them.
They cannot overrule the wage earner. They don't get the final say, but, and it's a massive but, they are in the room, they're sitting at the kitchen table, and they have a voice.
And it's a specific kind of voice. It's not a command. It's experience.
The sources break this down into specific lines of dialogue. Imagine the House of Commons. The adult child is rushing to pass a new law. They're excited, they have a mandate, they want it done by Tuesday. The House of Lords leans in and says,
have you thought this through?
Exactly. Or, this didn't work the last time you tried it in the 90s.
Right. Or even, I'm not saying you're wrong, just slow down a second. This bit here on page 10, that's going to cause you a headache in 6 months.
It's the voice of someone who has seen it all before. They aren't trying to take over the mortgage. They're trying to stop you from flooding the basement.
And think about that dynamic. Most of the time, the adult child, the Commons, is going to do what they want anyway. They'll roll their eyes, say, okay, thanks, Grandma, we hear you, and proceed.
Sure.
But sometimes, often enough to matter, that intervention causes a pause. They rethink. They tweak the wording.
Or they realize, oh, actually, we missed a huge loophole there.
The function is an obstruction then. It's a check on enthusiasm.
It's a second pair of eyes. And usually a much older, more experienced pair of eyes.
Okay, the metaphor works. It frames the relationship perfectly.
Oh.
But we can't just rely on vibes.
No, let's get into the weeds. What does this grandparenting look like when you have a 1,000-page legal document in front of you? I assume they aren't literally baking cookies.
No, sadly not. This is where we move to the literal work. And frankly, the work is incredibly dry, which is why it never makes the highlight reels. The Lords reviews legislation line by line.
Line by line sounds like a punishment. It is tedious, exacting work.
Right.
But it is vital. They propose amendments. They ask what the source calls technical and awkward questions. This is where the composition of the House really matters.
You mean it's not just retired politicians?
Right. It also includes scientists, business leaders, former generals, academics, surgeons, the life peers, people appointed for their expertise.
So if the government brings in a bill about, say, regulating AI, you might actually have a professor of computer science sitting there.
Exactly. Let's make this concrete. Say the Commons wants to pass a law banning dangerous dogs. The intention is good, right? Everyone wants safe streets. The Commons, the adult child, says ban the bad dogs.
Simple enough.
But the Lords will look at the text and say, okay, define dangerous. Does that cover a poodle that nips someone? A police dog doing its job?
Who decides? A vet? A police officer?
A judge, exactly. The Commons provides the political will, we want this done, and the Lords provides the technical reality check. Here's how the words need to be written so the law doesn't collapse.
I see. So they force the government to define its terms. But this brings us to the big friction point, the complaint that they just slow everything down.
That is the classic criticism. The government is elected to get things done. They have a mandate. If the Lord spends 3 weeks arguing about the definition of a poodle, aren't they just dragging their feet?
Whoa, yeah.
Here is where we need to reframe it. The expert rebuttal is that delay is not the aim. Delay is a side effect. The aim is review.
And you can't review something properly without taking time to do it.
The source uses a fantastic phrase here, friction by design.
Friction by design. I like that. It sounds counterintuitive in a world that loves efficiency.
But efficiency isn't always the goal when making laws that can send people to prison. You want friction. You want resistance. You want someone to say, wait, look again. That isn't obstruction. It's quality control.
It's like if I write a really important email. If I just hit send, it's fast. Maximum efficiency. But if I send it to you to proofread first, that creates a delay. You might find typos or tell me I sound rude. The goal isn't to stop the email. It's to save me from embarrassing myself.
Perfect analogy. And the Lords usually doesn't block legislation outright. They don't say, no, you can't have this law. They send it back. They say, this bit doesn't quite work, or this definition is too loose.
So they're marking the homework and asking the Commons to correct it.
Yes, and then the Commons can decide. Sometimes they agree and say, good catch, and change course, and sometimes they don't.
Which brings up the million-dollar question. If the Commons has the power, and the Lords is just the grandparent giving advice, can't the Commons just hit an ignore button?
That is the question that always follows. And the answer is complex. It's a yes and no.
Of course it is. Nothing is simple in the British Constitution.
Well, think about it. There is no big red button on the Prime Minister's desk marked, ignore the Lords. It isn't a shrug and move on situation. The system is designed to make ignoring them difficult and crucially expensive.
Expensive in terms of money.
Expensive in terms of time. And in politics, time is the only currency that really matters. To override the Lords, the government has to bring the legislation back again.
Okay.
They have to wait. They have to use the Parliament Acts in some cases, which takes a year. Even for standard ping pong, where the bill goes back and forth, it eats up days of parliamentary time.
Ah, I see. So if the government spends 2 weeks fighting the Lords on the Dangerous Dogs Act, that is 2 weeks they aren't passing their Fix the Economy Act.
Exactly. The Lords uses time as leverage. And there is a political cost, too. To override them, the government has to stand up in public and say, out loud, we have listened to the concerns of these experts, we still disagree, and we are prepared to own the consequences.
That's a really important distinction. It turns a quiet bad decision into a loud bad decision.
Or a loud decision the government strongly believes in. But either way, they have to own it. They can't slip it through unnoticed. If the grandparent is screaming this is a bad idea and the adult child does it anyway,
Then it goes wrong.
the adult child can't say nobody warned me. It removes the excuse of ignorance.
That's actually a lot more powerful than I gave it credit for. I always thought it was toothless because they couldn't veto. But making someone publicly own their refusal to listen, that's meaningful.
It is. But it leaves us with this weird feeling, doesn't it? Even if we accept the grandparent role and the friction by design, it still feels odd.
It feels undemocratic. I mean, let's be honest. We're justifying a room full of people who are there for life, answering to no one. It's a hard sell in 2026.
That unease is very real, and the source addresses this. It's a massive contradiction. You have a body that is unelected and unaccountable, yet it shapes laws and forces elected governments into uncomfortable positions.
So how did we end up here? Because other countries, the U.S. Senate, for example, they have an upper house, but it's elected. It has legitimacy. Why is ours so weird?
This is where we have to look at evolution versus design. The House of Lords was never designed. It wasn't a blueprint.
Nobody sat down with a blank sheet of paper and said, I know what we need. 800 unelected people in robes acting like a grandparent.
That would be a very strange brainstorming session. No, the reality is that the Lords accumulated. We are talking about centuries of history. Originally, it was powerful landowners and the church protecting their own interests.
Right. It wasn't about scrutiny back then. It was about raw power.
Exactly. But over the last 100 years, it has been pruned and patched. The biggest change was in 1999, when most of the hereditary peers, the ones there just because their dad was a lord, were removed.
That was a huge shift. That's when it moved from aristocracy to appointed experts.
Mostly, yes. We still have 92 hereditaries hanging on, which is a whole other quirk, but the vast majority now are life peers. This changed the psychology of the room. It stopped being a room of landowners protecting their estates and started being a room of professionals checking the grammar of the laws.
So it's like an old house where people kept building extensions and knocking down walls without ever looking at the original floor plan.
That is the perfect way to view it. And the result is that we are left with a structure that most people would never design from scratch today. We'd probably build an elected Senate.
But an elected Senate would behave differently, wouldn't it?
This is the crucial point. If the upper house was elected, they would feel they had a mandate. They would feel they had a right to block the government, not just advise it. You see this in the U.S., where the Senate can completely deadlock everything.
Because they can say, hey, the people voted for us too.
Exactly. But because the Lords knows it is unelected, because they know they are on thin ice democratically, they tend to hold back. They advise, they revise, but they rarely block. The source calls this a functional accident.
A functional accident. I love that. It suggests that by failing to modernize it fully, we stumbled into a system that actually works quite well for scrutiny.
It creates a specific type of scrutiny you might not get in a purely elected chamber, where everyone is worrying about re-election. They're worrying about headlines, Twitter, their party whip.
They're thinking, how does this vote look on a campaign leaflet?
Precisely. But a life peer, sitting in the Lords at age 70, doesn't care about a campaign leaflet. They aren't getting fired. This insulation allows them to be the pedantic grandparent.
So the lack of democracy is actually a feature, not a bug, in this specific context.
In the context of technical review, yes. It creates a space for long-term thinking that the House of Commons, which operates on a fast-paced 24-hour news cycle, simply doesn't have the bandwidth for.
So where does this leave us?
Yeah.
We've gone from, who are these old people, to realizing they're actually the quality control department of the UK government.
I think the main takeaway is dispelling the myths. The House of Lords isn't there to run the country. It isn't there to block democracy. And it isn't just a retirement home.
It's the grandparent.
It is the grandparent. It exists to review, to slow things down just enough to prevent mistakes, and to ask the questions the government might prefer to avoid.
And understanding that really changes how you look at the news.
Yeah.
When you hear Lords defeats government, it doesn't mean a constitutional crisis. It just means the grandparent said, think again.
And now the ball is back in the adult child's court. It helps decipher that back and forth ping pong we see. It isn't broken. It is the design working.
It's fascinating because it turns something that looks archaic into something that is surprisingly functional. But look, we can't wrap this up without acknowledging the lingering question. Just because it works, does that mean it's right?
And that is the final provocative thought our source leaves us with. We have established what it does now, but looking back at its messy history, at how it just sort of happened, is this really the best way to get that scrutiny?
Right. Could we get a grandparent that was elected?
Yeah.
Or smaller? Or less expensive? Or one that didn't involve wearing robes?
Or one that represented the geography of the country better. The question isn't, does it do anything? The question is this the only way to do it? And perhaps the most interesting question of all, if we look back at the very beginning, what was it actually meant to do in the first place?
It certainly wasn't meant to be a technical revision chamber for digital privacy laws.
No. It has evolved into a role that it was never designed for. It's a happy accident of history. But whether we should keep relying on an accident is a question for the voters and the adult child in the Commons to decide.
That is a massive question, and maybe one for another deep dive. But for now, next time you see those red benches on TV, just remember, they're not just sleeping, they're checking the homework.
Indeed. They're making sure we don't accidentally ban police dogs.
Exactly. That leaves you with a lot to chew on. That's it for this deep dive into the Lords. Thanks for listening.